Hello, my name is Jared Ludlow, and today we'll be continuing our discussion about Jerusalem, past, present, and future. And before we talked about Jerusalem up to the time of King David when he made it the capital. And then we talked about royal Jerusalem between the united monarchy and the divided monarchy when Jerusalem became the capital of the Southern Empire. And today we'll continue talking about Jerusalem under the empires. So starting with the Babylonians and then Persians and on and so forth. My lifetime, I've been able to live in Jerusalem about 3.5 years of my life. My father was a religion professor, and we lived there when he did study abroad programs. And so I went as a kid. Then I went as a student on the study abroad program. And then I've taught at the BYU Jerusalem Center twice for a year each. And so I've had a lot of wonderful experiences in Jerusalem with the BYU study abroad programs. And I'm currently teaching ancient scripture here at BYU. And so let's do a little historical overview of some of the different imperial conquests of Jerusalem. As I mentioned, it started with the Babylonian conquest around 586 BC, where as part of that conquest, the first temple, Solomon's temple, was destroyed. And many Jews from the southern kingdom were taken off into exile to Babylon. And this was quite a crisis of faith for a lot of Jews because they were out of the covenant land. The temple, the house of God that represented the presence of God, was no longer standing. And so they started wondering, well, what do we do now? In fact, Psalms 137 captures some of their feelings. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. If I prefer not Jerusalem above my chief joy. So this psalm captures that still Jerusalem was the center of a lot of their love and attention towards God and their desire to eventually come back. And so when the Babylonians were conquered by the Persians, as happened with a lot of ancient Near East empires, when one empire conquered the other, they basically took over most of the land of the previous empire and then often even expanded it. And the Persian Empire was a little different in that they allowed religious groups, not just the Jews, but they allowed the Jews to return and rebuild the temple. They even supported, apparently, financially, some of the cost of rebuilding this temple. And so this became known as the Second Temple. They also allowed the Jewish governor to come back and help rebuild the walls of the temple and the city. And so this is the time of Ezra, Nehemiah, Zerubbabel, and others who come back and help try to bring Jerusalem to what it was before. However, they weren't as wealthy as, for example, during the time of Solomon. So the temple didn't have the same grandeur that it did before. They did the best that they could. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. They, a couple of hundred years later, conquered by Alexander the Great and the Greeks, and he goes through this quick, conquest of a huge tract of land, but he doesn't live very long, and in fact never makes it back to his homeland, dies actually in Babylon, and so his empire gets divided among his former generals. And where this affects Jerusalem and the land of Israel particularly is there were two generals, Ptolemaeus down in Egypt, Seleucus up in Syria, and Jerusalem and Israel was right in between. And so they vied for power of this important land bridge back and forth. And so sometimes they were under Ptolemaic power and influence, and sometimes under Seleucid. And particularly at 200 BC, the Seleucids take over Jerusalem and start implementing some religious changes that end up leading to a revolt by the Jews. And this is sometimes known as the Maccabean Revolt. And it begins a period called the Hasmonean dynasty. That's the family name, the Hasmoneans. Maccabeans is more of a nickname given to one of the sons of Mattathias, the kind of father of this dynasty. And so it's also sometimes referred to as the Maccabean period. And religiously, this is significant because during this Seleucid period, they had desecrated the temple, and by reconquering the temple in Jerusalem, they were able to cleanse it again, rededicate it. In fact, that's the meaning of the word Hanukkah, and that's why the festival is called Hanukkah, is dedication of the temple. So they're able to cleanse the temple and make it pure again. So this is a post-biblical festival, not written in the Old Testament, but comes from this time period between the Old and New Testaments. We can hear more about it in what we call the Apocrypha in the books of Maccabees that come from that time period. Well, this Hasmonean dynasty doesn't last very long, and a century later Rome is expanding eastward, and this territory comes under their control. And they decide initially to rule it basically through vassal kings, and Herod the Great is probably the best known vassal king. So Rome is still certainly in charge of it, but Herod does the day-to-day operations in the land and just make sure taxes keep flowing to Rome. So let's go back and look a little bit more at some of these things, particularly, as I mentioned, this coming back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. Now, what's interesting in Jewish history is actually not all the Jews wanted to come back to Jerusalem. They had settled in Babylon, and they felt like, actually, this isn't too bad. And so a significant Jewish community remains in Babylon. And that shows up later when we see the compilations of what we call the Talmud. There's actually two Talmuds. There's a Palestinian or Jerusalem Talmud, and there's a Babylonian Talmud. And so these Jews remained in the land there, really all the way up into the 1900s. With the establishment of the State of Israel, suddenly became no longer comfortable to be living in some of the Arab countries, and so that kind of saw the end of this Jewish community in Babylon. But what we will focus on is those Jews who decided to come back and wanted to reestablish Jerusalem and its temple and the covenant land, etc. And so one of their first tasks was supposed to be rebuilding the temple. But apparently they also wanted to rebuild their homes and businesses and their lives. And so the prophet Haggai came along and gave the word of the Lord to them, saying, "Is it time for you, O ye, to dwell in your sealed or paneled houses?" In other words, you have nice finished houses. "And this house," meaning the temple, "lie waste? Now therefore thus saith the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. Ye have sown much and bring in little. Ye eat, but ye have not enough. Ye drink, but ye are not filled with drink. Ye clothe you, but there is none warm. And he that earneth wages to put it into a bag with holes." In other words, he's warning them that they're going to do all this work, and it's really not going to be for any lasting purpose, unless they can put the house of the Lord first. And so it's kind of calling them out, telling them you need to put this as a priority. And so they start working more on the temple to rebuild it. And the book of Ezra captures this moment when they finally, are finishing and they're going to celebrate. And it talks about how when the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, they set the priests in their apparel with trumpets, the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, to praise the Lord, after the ordinance of David, king of Israel. And they sang together by chorus in praising and giving thanks unto the Lord, because he is good, for his mercy endureth forever toward Israel. And all the people shouted with a great shout, and they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the priests and Levites and chief of the fathers, who were ancient men, in other words, the older people who had seen the previous temple, Solomon's temple, that had seen the first house, when the foundation of this house was laid before their eyes, wept with a loud voice. And yet many shouted aloud for joy. And so there's this conflicting feelings. On the one hand, they're very happy and rejoicing that they're back and they're rebuilding this temple that had been laid waste. But then there's sadness because they know it's not going to be as grand and as great as the previous temple, and they're still mourning the loss of that temple. And the last verse kind of catches this cacophony of sound and voices, so that the people could not discern the noise of the shout of joy from the noise of the weeping of the people. For the people shouted with a loud shout, and the noise was heard afar off. So people just heard all this noise, and it was hard to tell whether they're weeping for sadness or rejoicing for joy, etc. So that kind of captures a little bit of, again, how happy they were to be back in the land, back building up a temple so they could resume the worship that takes place there, but then a little bit of sadness for what they had lost. And as I mentioned, Alexander the Great then comes on the scene, and you can see in this map this incredible campaign that his forces went on. They took kind of a little detour down into Jerusalem and conquered that area, and then went all the way into Egypt, then came back up and moved across Mesopotamia, modern Iraq and Iran, and moved all the way to the Indus River Valley near northern India. And that's where his soldiers said, enough, we want to go back home. We want to enjoy some of the spoils of all this conquest. And so they start making their way back, and as I mentioned before, that's when he dies in Babylon. It's a little unclear exactly what he died of. Some think he was just over feasting and basically died from all the celebrating and eating and drinking he was doing. Others think maybe he could have been poisoned by who knows who, because there was a lot of competition for this power, but also a lot of enemies of people that he had conquered. But certainly what we know is that the Persian Empire is replaced, and this new Greek Empire is even more expansive because it includes the land of Greece and Macedon, where they came from, and then all the way into Egypt and so forth. But as I mentioned, it was short-lived and then divided among his generals, and then that led to the Maccabees and their conquests. But what we'll focus on particularly is during the time of the Roman Empire, because this is also the time that Jesus has interaction with Jerusalem. Of course, he spends a lot of his ministry up in the Galilee area, and he grew up in the area of Nazareth and born down in Bethlehem, but Jerusalem is a place that he goes occasionally for festivals, as men were asked to do for some of these pilgrimage festivals, such as Passover. So the Gospels point out when Jesus goes down to celebrate some of these various festivals. And of course, he will spend his last week down in Jerusalem that leads to his suffering in the Garden of Gethsemane and his crucifixion on the cross. But Jerusalem also will be the site of his grand resurrection. And so for Christianity, the core events of Jesus' ministry, his atoning sacrifice and resurrection, take place in Jerusalem. And so we'll try to get a little feel for not only what Jerusalem may have looked like during his time, but also how Christians celebrate and have built up places of worship for some of these events in Jerusalem. We also want to pay attention to how Herod the Great, who carries often this title the Great, not because he was a great person, because he really was not, and would kill anybody that he felt was a threat to him, including sons and wives, and so certainly not a great person. But he was a great builder, a great visionary. He could see, a port city of Caesarea along the coast, and was able to marshal the labor needed to bring that to pass. Or he built a fortress palace on the edges of a mesa cliff area down in Masada. And he did the same with Jerusalem. He wanted Jerusalem, and particularly the temple, to be kind of the crown jewel. He wanted to show off to the Roman Empire and to the emperors that he had this wealth and power, and so he created this incredible temple complex. And so he remodeled the temple. It wasn't really a third temple per se, but a drastic remodel of the second temple. And so if we look at the different Jerusalem temples, for about 1,000 years there were temples in Jerusalem, starting with Solomon's temple around 950 BC. And then the second temple under Zerubbabel and during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, and that's around 515 BC. And then Herod starts his remodel project, and really that continues long after his death, at least particularly around Jerusalem and other parts. But this temple ends up getting destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans. And so again, about 1,000 years with temple. And I really like this cutaway because it shows particularly what Herod has to do if he wants to expand the plazas, the courtyards around the temple. He has to increase the kind of foundation walls because this is on a hill. This is usually known as Mount Moriah, and it's connected back to Abraham as the site where he brought Isaac to offer him. And so the very tip of this hill or mount is where the bedrock is, where they feel like some of these things happen, and some Jewish tradition even put the creation foundation stone coming from this area, and that the Ark of the Covenant sat on this bedrock at the top. And so initially Solomon did build a little plaza platform around, and you can see that in the initial square here. And then during the Hasmonean period, they started expanding it to the south to make it a little bit bigger. But you can see Herod then expands on both the south, the west, and the north sides. He didn't expand the east side because it was already too challenging with the Kidron Valley that dropped off pretty steeply down that way. And so Herod's plaza suddenly grows quite significantly from the size of what was there before. And he also included a lot of different ways of accessing the courtyard. So there are double gates down here on the south, triple gates. Then he had arches that supported grand staircases that people could go up and access the area other ways, or gates along here, another arch with another grand causeway. And so the way I kind of think about it is, you know, when we have stadiums and arenas and you're trying to get a lot of people in and out, you have, you know, tunnels and portals and, you know, big staircases and ramps and things to get as many people in and out as easy as possible. And that's what Herod was trying to do. And you can see some evidence of this on the outside of the wall. As you can maybe imagine, you know, with Legos, you don't want to build a wall where all the Legos stack up straight on each other, because then they can easily come apart. What you want to do is alternate them so that it strengthens them. But if you look closely here, there's a seam that goes up where these expansions were added later. So the wall used to go inside, but now it continues on. And so, you know, you had to be a little careful there with engineering and all to keep it secure, but it was able to expand it so that it ended up looking something like this, where the temple now is almost dwarfed by these courtyards and stoa or porticos that surround it. We read in the scriptures about Solomon's porch, which would be on the east side, over on this side. And then the royal basilica or stoa is over here, And that, as we'll see, was a place that probably the Sanhedrin sometimes would meet. The end result of all this is Herod created the largest temple complex in the Roman Empire, 36 acres all around. So if you can kind of picture Temple Square in Salt Lake, where the temple is just one part of it, and there's other buildings, garden areas, fountains, etc. That's, over a third less in size than this temple complex there. And according to historians, this is the largest temple complex in the Roman Empire. And so, again, this is Herod's way of trying to, I guess you could say, show off to the Roman Empire. And this is a little hard to see, but this shows the blueprints of the different areas and what he was trying to accomplish. And of course, one of the things that he was trying to do also was to protect this area. Because if you can imagine, if there's any disturbance by the people against Rome, it would likely occur near the temple, because that's where the greatest groups of people would gather together. And so he built the Antonia Fortress here on the north side, where a garrison of soldiers could be stationed and have immediate access to the temple courtyards if there were any problems. And we do read, particularly in the book of Acts, of some of these events happening, particularly with Paul, for example, where soldiers have to come out and stop a disturbance. And it actually saved Paul's life in one case when he was surrounded by a group of Jews trying to kill him for what they perceived was wrongdoings that he was doing up near the temple. But it created this wonderful complex that also had different areas of sacredness, I guess you could say. And, a change from Latter-day Saints and ancient Judaism is, for Latter-day Saints, anybody who is worthy and has a temple recommend can enter the temple. But for ancient Jews, only Levites and priests could enter the area around the temple or inside the temple. And that was only for special certain duties or occasions. And only the high priest once a year could go in the Holy of Holies. And so it wasn't a public space, the temple itself, where people went, but they did go around these other courtyards and areas. And this area is called the Courtyard of the Women, because Jewish women were allowed in this area. And it was also the place for the treasury and storehouse, because if you've got an altar, you've got a lot of wood, you've got oil and other needs. And so they stored a lot of things here. They kept a lot of the money here. And then they could bring offerings up to this doorway, where they could be passed on to a Levite or a priest to then take care of at the altar, which was right behind here. And so Jews would often come to this part of the temple, but Gentiles were not allowed into this area. These little barricades here warned Gentiles that they could not go any further beyond that. They were welcome in these courtyards beyond that. And the Stoa, as we'll see, provided places where people could come and teach, listen, etc. And so when Jesus says he taught at the temple, probably what it's saying is he's under, one of these colonnades, and people are sitting around, gathered, and listening to him teach. And likewise, the apostles later on in the book of Acts, it talks about them going there. But as I mentioned, Gentiles were not allowed past this one area, and we've even found one of the stones, they were kind of a warning stone to Gentiles, that if they went past that point, they could be put to death. So if we think our temple recommend deaths are hard to get past, this was much, much harder back then. But these porticos, as I mentioned, were a great place to gather, and it provided shade and if it rained, protection from the rain. Now the Grand Stoa Basilica on the left side, or the south side down here, served as offices of the chief priests and the Sanhedrin, this body of elders that helped interpret Jewish law. The Romans still allowed them to to meet and discuss their law. But of course, Roman law was supreme over all the political aspects and civic life of the people. On the southeast corner is what we sometimes refer to as the pinnacle of the temple, at least the traditional pinnacle. If you remember, during the temptations of Jesus, one of the temptations was being brought to the pinnacle of the temple, and the temptation was to jump down from here and allow angels to swoop down and create this grand spectacle that everybody would see. And it was usually assumed to be on this side because we're looking up from the Kidron Valley, and it's this very deep drop-off. And so it would make it even more dramatic. But because of some archaeological finds, now more think it would be the northeast corner that I'll show you a little bit later. And part of the reason for that is what they found there, but also because there'd be a lot more people on the market street at the bottom of that pinnacle. And again, that was the temptation, trying to get Jesus to create this grand spectacle for a lot of people so they would suddenly believe in him. But Jesus knew that that wasn't the way that he was supposed to gain followers, and so that's why he resisted this temptation. Along the south side, as I mentioned earlier, was areas where lots of people could come up to access the temple courtyards up above. And so they had these staircases leading up to these gates, arched gateways, double and triple gates. And you can still go there today and see some of these stairways that date back to this first century. Some have been reconstructed, and so you can kind of see the difference between these down here that are more eroded and not as secure for stepping versus these others up here that have been plastered and covered with stepping stones and so forth. So sometimes, people want to say, well, I want to walk where Jesus walked. Sometimes that's hard because cities build up over time, and so you're actually walking over where Jesus walked back in the day. But there's a few places around Jerusalem where potentially you could walk where Jesus walked, and I'm sure Jesus and his disciples went up these steps, exactly where we don't know, and went through some of these gates. One of these gates, you can just see the edge of it here. It gets closed off, and a wall is brought out from it to enclose a palace area that gets built later during the Umayyad Arab period. And then here you can still see the outline of the triple gates. And again, these get filled in, so there's no longer access up to the Temple Mount area from these gateways. But on the other side of those, you can see where the passageways still exist. Been changed with carpeting and so forth, lighting today, but they before would have accessed this area. So all along under here, these grand archways to support the plaza up on top. That was one of the Roman engineering feats of the day, was figuring out ways to support large plazas for temples and government buildings and so forth up on top. And we see various examples of this throughout ancient Near East and Rome and other places. So they were masters of archways and using it for aqueducts and for support and other things. And so these archways supported the plaza up, particularly on this side is where we're seeing those there. And this is a reconstruction of one of these grand staircases that came down. This accessed the area near the Royal Basilica, or Stoa. And so people could come up, and here was the market street down below. Now what's kind of interesting is you go back over 100 years, and this is what that archway looked like. You can just see barely the bottom of an arch, and it's basically at ground level here. We've got a little donkey here and a person. They're just basically underneath it. Well, starting in 1967 and following, they started doing excavations there. And here's now the archway up there, and ground level is much lower. And maybe this shot actually gives it a better image. Here we finally get down to street level during the time of Jesus, during this first century. And this was the main market street. And so there were shops lined up along this wall and along this side. And here's what the shop entrances look like on the other side. Some of these were the foundation for that grand staircase that went up. Now, one other significant note here is this pile of huge blocks. And these blocks actually came from up on top during the Roman destruction of the temple, and all the plaza and courtyards and colonnades around there. They started pushing these blocks off the top and smashing the shops and the street below. You can still see some of these paving stones on the street just smashed from these big blocks that came down on them. And they've now gathered them kind of together in one big pile. But for Christians, this is significant because in Matthew 24, Jesus prophesies that not a stone shall be left standing on another. And he's making a prophecy about a future destruction of the Jerusalem temple. And this happens about 4 decades after he made this prophecy. And while these blocks, we don't know if they actually came from the temple itself or the colonnades or whatever, they do demonstrate that all of this material was pushed off from above down below until there was not a stone left standing on one another. And so we kind of see the fulfillment of the prophecy with these big blocks down below. And so, as I mentioned, these were some shop entrances, and you can see the market street in front. And this was a place where they could come to trade money. They could buy animals for sacrifices. They could buy food, particularly if they've been traveling. This was all legitimate. In fact, if you remember when Jesus goes to cleanse the temple, what he's cleansing are the courtyards up above, where apparently people now were bringing their money-changing tables and their animals for purchase and so forth. And it was desecrating. It was turning those courtyards into places of business, or as Jesus says, a den of thieves, rather than a quiet place of prayer. What he called out for was a place of prayer for all nations. That means the Gentiles. This was the only place the Gentiles could go to experience the spirit of the temple and to pray if they wanted to. Kind of like our temple grounds, or anybody can go there and access them and enjoy the beauty and the peace of those areas. But if it's a commercial area, it loses a lot of that spirit. And so what Jesus was complaining about is not what they're doing, but where they're doing it. He's fine with them doing it down below at the market street. That's what it's made for. But the temple area was not for that purpose. And so I think it's significant to see this market street and realize this is how it should be done. And Jesus was condemning them for how they were doing it up above, and probably, requiring people to pay to be able to access up there, and profiting from these things that people needed to do, like get animals for sacrifice or trade money for the temple tax and these kinds of things for their offerings. But do it down here is basically what Jesus was saying, not up there. Now, another key find that they uncovered here in this area by the market street was what they think was the pinnacle station. This inscription that you can see, this is the replica. The original is in the Israel Museum, but they've kept a replica of what they found here. And it says the place of trumpeting, Lebeit HaTekiyah. And so here's a reconstruction of what they think it would have looked like. And so on certain festivals, and maybe even to welcome in the Sabbath, they would blow horns, trumpets, maybe sometimes the shofar, from this pinnacle area. And again, this was on the southwest side of the Temple Square plaza. And so this may be the pinnacle of the temple where Jesus was tempted to jump down and have angels swoop down and get him in front of all these people that would have been on the market street and at the shops and everything down below. And so it would have been located down here on this corner, whereas this traditional site is down on this over the Kidron Valley. So all of this area now has been excavated archaeologically, and it's a big archaeological park, from the getting down to the level of the first century Jerusalem, and again, mostly a lot of what Herod built up. And it gives us a little glimpse that in this map, it's facing east towards the Mount of Olives, and the city of Jerusalem was expanding to the west, getting larger and larger over here, and particularly the elites started building a lot of their residences there, and Herod had a palace on this side and so forth. And so it was going away from the original city of David further and further up here. They had other ways of accessing water, whereas before they had to be down there to be by the Gihon Spring and the water source there. And so here's a reconstruction of this expansion to the west, and some of the, again, more elites building residences and palaces and other Roman civic buildings and things to be more like other Roman cities. And down here by the city of David, down below the Temple Mount area, was a pool. It was called the Pool of Siloam. And this was a significant reservoir of water that the Hezekiah's tunnel brought in from the Gihon Spring, and it was stored here. But for many centuries, it was assumed to be in a different spot until they were doing some sewage work and other things, and they were digging up some of the dirt there, and all of a sudden they started finding these long rows of steps. That's what's fascinating about the land of Israel, is you start going into the ground and suddenly you can come across a city or a road, or in this case a pool. And they finally realized this is actually the Pool of Siloam. And so where they thought that Hezekiah's tunnel ended actually wasn't the end. It continued on into this pool. And here's a reconstruction of kind of what they think it looked like, with steps on all sides going down into a large reservoir and the southern end of the wall just on the edge of it. And so this would be a place probably where a lot of pilgrims coming into the city from after traveling for a while, this would be their first chance to kind of refresh themselves and cleanse themselves to get ready to go further up the hill towards the temple. And in fact, they've also uncovered this grand staircase that led from this pool all the way up to that market street on the southwest corner of the Temple Mount. And so doing some excavations underground, because the city again has been built up over the centuries, they've uncovered these steps of this stairway that went up. Now this excavating is controversial because you're under a neighborhood up above, and homes and shops and other things. But that's part of the politics of the land, of who controls what and is allowed to do what. And so the Israelis have allowed these archaeologists and others to do this work coming underneath. And you can now walk from the Pool of Siloam underground all the way up and come out at the southwest corner of the Temple Mount by that market street that I showed before. So this is, again, part of expanding and renovating and remodeling that Herod foresaw and ordered. And And he, expanded all the plaza walls, as we mentioned before. And so here you can see what we often call Herodian stones that have certain features, and this little frame around it is one of those features. It's kind of decorative. It's not needed, but it kind of demonstrated the craft of the stonemasons. Each of these cubes or ashlars, is what they're often called, blocks of limestone usually. The average stone weighs between 2 and 8 tons and is about 15 feet wide. And each stone, as you can see, has a finely chiseled border cut around the edges, a little more than ½ an inch deep and between 2 to 8 inches wide. And so still today you can go and you can immediately see the stones that date back to the Herodian period based on this. And when you go to the Western Wall, the main prayer area for Jews today, remember this is the wall of the courtyards, not the wall of the temple itself, but the courtyards that went around it. The lower rows of stone, or courses as they're called, date back to the time of Herod. And you'll see some of them with this frame or this edge around it. So today, where the Western Wall is just this one portion of the entire Western Wall that used to go around the plaza, and it still does, but now it's been built up over later centuries because the top layers either were destroyed or they just built up even higher. But they've now done excavations so that you can go all the way along in a tunnel. They call it the Kotel Tunnel. Kotel is the Hebrew word that refers to the Western Wall. And you can go all the way to the end of that. And they've also done a few other things under here that's interesting. This is under one of those archways for a grand staircase. This one that came up here, Wilson's Arch. And they've turned that into a synagogue for men. And so men can come under here. And it's just basically an extension of the Western Wall. You can see the other part out in the public, and this is more tucked away. And then you can go down, as I mentioned, into this tunnel. And this is more of an archaeological area, and so any tour groups and so forth can come through here, men and women. And it looks somewhat like this, following the wall. And again, these are Herodian period walls that go along. And this particular stone here I want to make mention of because it's the largest one that they found under here. And it's sometimes referred to as the Master Course stone. And it's located between Warren's Gate and Wilson's Arch. And it's 44 feet long, 11.5 feet high, and 15 feet wide. So we don't, it's hard to see how far in it goes. But you can imagine all the weight that it needs to support above. It needs to be pretty massive. Now, how they got it to this place and put it into place, that's one of the engineering questions that they still haven't quite figured out. They have various theories, kind of like, how did they build the pyramids? Well, there's various theories and so forth. But what's interesting is it not just is to support what comes above, but it's also to stabilize the smaller stones under it. And by smaller, these are still pretty big blocks, as you can see. But it stabilizes them, and it sits 20 feet above the Herodian street level, so they had to get it up 20 feet above that street level, and it's 33 feet above the bedrock. And it's basically, you see, it extends beyond the left edge of this photo and past the right edge. And where you see smaller stones up above, that's filled in because the Romans were trying to push all these stones over, but they got to this one and it was just too massive and they couldn't do anything with it. So they're chipping away at it, and they finally just were like, we give up. And then they filled it in later with some other stuff. So they couldn't dismantle this part. These little rectangular holes that you see, that's not from the Herodian period, but that's centuries later when they were trying to plaster this wall to turn it into a big cistern to hold water for some of the homes that were up above. And so some of these homes would use this area down below for storage or water, etc., until these archaeologists now have come in and created this space. Now there is one part of it where you often will see women particularly praying, and this is one of the gates that's filled in that would have led close to the temple. In fact, this is the spot that some Jews feel is the closest to the Holy of Holies that would have been in the temple. And so really devout Jews will not go up on top of the Temple Mount area. They don't want to desecrate it, and it's a Muslim prayer area, so they avoid it sometimes. And so they'll come here to be as close to the Holy of Holies as they can. So some grand building by Herod around the temple, and to expand it and to make it this great jewel of the Roman Empire, and try to bring back some of that grandeur of Solomon's period when it was a big, beautiful temple. Now, just to the north of this Temple Mount area is what we refer to often as the pools of Bethesda, or the sheep pools. This was a place where the sheep could be brought and cleansed before going to the temple right next door for sacrifice. But it was also a place, as we learn in John chapter 5, that some believed was a place of healing. So people would gather for healing. And it's interesting, in the text it talks about 5 porches. And usually these porches are referring to these colonnades. And usually if you have a square or rectangle, you just have 4. You have 1, 2, 3, 4. But then they finally realized that it's actually 2 pools, and there's a 5th porch that runs on the dike between the 2 pools. And so when it talks in the text about bubbling water, what archaeologists now think happens is water from the one pool bubbles up through a special drain or sluice up into the other pool. And when that happens, then people believed that the first one in would be healed. But there may be a much more mundane reason for this bubbling up. And anyway, it's been in ruins for centuries, and it's one of the more confusing sites when you go to it to try to figure out, well, wait, where was the pool, and what's going on here? And that's because the pool level is, the bottom of the pool is way down here, and then of course it had the walls built up on the side, but they've been built up even more. So the steps down to it were probably over here, coming down towards the pool. And then this used to be a big Byzantine Christian church that had arches over and straddled these 2 pools back in the day. And so that's what you see mostly the ruins of, is a later Christian church built on the site to commemorate the great healing that happened here. So the 2 pools in Jerusalem had significant healing episodes attached to them. Here was the man that was invalid, basically couldn't get around for, I believe it was 38 years. And Jesus seeks him out and finds him and then heals him. And he takes up his bed and he walks, and it turns into Sabbath controversy because Jesus had healed him on the Sabbath. The Pool of Siloam that we saw earlier, also in the Gospel of John, talks about a blind man that's healed. John chapter 9. This was somebody who'd been blind since birth. And if you remember, Jesus meets him and rubs some spit and mud or dirt together to make mud, places it on his eyes, and tells him to go down to the Pool of Siloam to be healed. And so it took the faith of this man that if I do this, it actually will work to do it. And he makes his way to the Pool of Siloam, washes his eyes, and then he's healed. And again, it leads to another controversy because it was done on the Sabbath and because people weren't sure that were you really blind and now you see, or were you faking it? But of course, he'd been blind since birth, so he's not going to just sit around faking it for a long time. Anyway, those two episodes both occur with pools and with healings. So it shows, that at some of the times that Jesus is in Jerusalem, some significant events occurred. Now, again, for Christians, why Jerusalem is so important is because of the atoning sacrifice of Jesus. And so on the Mount of Olives are some churches that commemorate the Garden of Gethsemane, or the suffering that Jesus had in the Garden of Gethsemane. And in this particular image, you can see two main churches, the Church of All Nations, Catholic Church, basically, and then the Russian Orthodox Mary Magdalene Church. And the Church of All Nations is called that because a lot of nations of the world have donated to restore and build up this church. And it's a lovely memorial to Jesus' suffering in Gethsemane. Of course, the text just says he went on the Mount of Olives, and we don't know exactly where that was. So these churches commemorate him coming to the Mount of Olives and depict his suffering in various ways. This is the main altar, and there's bedrock exposed here, in theory, I guess, where some think he could have been kneeling to pray. And then the mosaic up above in the main apse here shows Jesus praying on the rock. And then an angel starts coming down to strengthen him, as the text says. And so there's three apses in the church, and each one tells part of the scripture story that happened in Gethsemane and writes it out in Latin underneath it. And I had a very powerful experience here one time. I haven't really studied Latin, but I've studied Portuguese and other Romance languages enough that I could read it, and particularly following along with the scripture, pick out the words. And it was just kind of a powerful spiritual experience of what Jesus experienced in the Garden of Gethsemane. His suffering, his betrayal by one of his friends. And then the other panel also shows Jesus coming, or guards coming to take Jesus, and them falling back as Jesus' power is somewhat overwhelming to them. And next to the church, they've kept some of the orchards as they likely would have been during their time. Some people claim that these trees go all the way back. They do not. They're not that old. But of course, olive trees do sprout new seedlings, and so they could be descendants of those trees. But the key thing is it reminds us that this was an olive grove. It was also apparently an olive press. The place of the garden press of the olive, the garden of the olive press is basically what it's commemorating here. So another site, another church, a small one, just to the north side of that main church, is a little grotto. It's called the Grotto Church, and in here they found remnants of an olive press and the different machinery and equipment and water sources and all that you would need for an olive press. And so some think this, particularly when it's not harvest season, this could be a place where pilgrims could have come to stay the night when they're visiting Jerusalem. And so maybe Jesus and the apostles stayed down here, and then Jesus went up among the olive trees to pray. Probably the most significant church in Christianity is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And this marks the spot that many Christians believe where Jesus was crucified, his body taken off the cross, and then where he was buried, but then, of course, where he then was resurrected. And so Christians from all over the world will come to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, often very emotional for this opportunity to be there. Sometimes for Latter-day Saints, when they come here, it's a different experience. Partially because we don't have some of the same customs and traditions in our chapels. We don't usually have incense burning and all these candles and niches and altars and things like that. And also it doesn't look like a tomb. And that's because over the centuries, what had been a tomb area mostly has been taken away. And so in this image, you can see the hillside used to come down, and here's some of the tomb area there. And this would have been what they believed was Golgotha near the tomb area. But now it's all enclosed within this church. And all of this area is now gone, except for this little part of bedrock that still remains. And instead, they've built what they call the edicule over the site of where they think Jesus' tomb was. Now, there are some tombs still back in here that show that this was a tomb area, but the main part of the church just doesn't look like that. It's also a very confusing location because I think 7 different denominations have various parts of the church that they worship at. There's Syrian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Catholics, Armenians, Coptics, Ethiopians came a little later. They're up on the roof, for example, and so forth. And so that adds to the confusion because you see all these different types of worship going on and different styles. But as I mentioned, there's still some tomb areas over here on this side. But this is the main tomb area that they believe is here. And this is the main Greek Orthodox worship area there. And then all these side chapels and so forth. And this gives you kind of color-coded of the different denominations and who controls what. And so again, you can see it's quite a mix altogether. So people sometimes have to wait in long lines to access the small 2 rooms within this edicule. The first one represents where they might have prepared the body, and then further on where they actually buried the body. And about 3 people can get into that area at a time, and so you get in there and you just have a small time to appreciate it, and then you come out. Then the next group comes in, and so again, it's hard to really have a deep, meaningful experience with it because you're dealing with all of these other things. But for many Christians, this is the site, and many significant holidays are celebrated here throughout the Christian liturgical calendar. But for Latter-day Saints, a lot of them, and other Protestants, because they also don't have parts of the Church of Holy Sepulchre, they like to go to what's called the Garden Tomb. And this is probably familiar in pictures and so forth. And it looks like a tomb. There's a beautiful garden, and it's more peaceful. You can read scriptures and sing much easier. This is what it looks like on the inside, where you can see the benches that used to be there. There are some questions about the dating of this. It seems to come from a much earlier period. So reality is maybe neither site is the actual burial site of Jesus. But I like on the door of the Garden Tomb it says, "He's not here, for he is risen." And that's the point. We're not going to find where Jesus is buried because he's not buried there still. We'll find maybe where he was buried. But more than anything, we're there to have a spiritual experience, to remember that he was resurrected and that he was able to conquer death and overcome this. Whichever place we end up visiting, I would recommend going to both and having experiences at both. And it may, like I said, it may be at a third place. So those are some of the key Christian areas that are associated with Jesus and with Herod's building and so forth. We alluded to the fact that the Jews revolted in 70 AD. That led to the Jerusalem temple being destroyed. They decided to try another revolt in 135. That led to Jews basically being banned from the city of Jerusalem. It gets changed to a Roman city. Aelia Capitolina, and it later becomes a Christian city, the Byzantine Jerusalem. It becomes part of the Eastern Roman Empire. When Constantine converts to Christianity, then suddenly it takes on a whole different importance. And it's the place where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre will be built up. I mean, this church dates back to starting 400 A.D. It's what the Crusaders fought over to maintain access to it. Meanwhile, the Temple Mount area is just left desolate, empty, without the temple up there. So it's a period of Christian growth in the city, and churches and so forth being built around. And besides the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, there's other churches commemorating other events related to Jesus, including the one we mentioned at the Pool of Bethesda. But Jerusalem was always an important city to Jerusalem. In fact, in the Gospel of Luke, it talks about, Jesus' triumphal entry into the city that started that last week. And we won't take time to read that story, but in the Gospel of Luke, in chapter 19, verse 37, it says, "And when he was come nigh," Jesus was come nigh, "even now at the descent of the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of the disciples began to rejoice and praise God with a loud voice for all the mighty works that they had seen, saying, Blessed be the King that cometh in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest. And some of the Pharisees from among the multitude said unto them, Master, rebuke thy disciples. And he answered and said unto them, I tell you that if these should hold their peace, the stones would immediately cry out. And then when he was come near, he beheld the city, and wept over it, saying, If thou hadst known, even thou, at least in this thy day, the things which belong unto thy peace, but now they are hid from thine eyes. For the day shall come upon thee that thine enemies shall cast a trench about thee, and compass thee round, and keep thee in on every side, and shall lay thee even with the ground, and thy children within thee, and they shall not leave in thee one stone upon another, because thou knewest not the time of thy visitation. And then it says he went into the temple and so forth. So Jesus wept over the city because it meant so much to him, and he knew the experiences that they had had in the past with prophets and others, and the experiences he was trying to bring them with some of the healings that he did around the city and in the city of Jerusalem. But again, they were rejecting him, or would reject him soon. And he wept over this significant city. I say that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.